If I were to ask you what the most well-known feature of Monkey D. Luffy was, would your answer be his straw hat, his iconic outfit, or his unendingly optimistic grin? Well, I think that Luffy is most well known for his iconic devil fruit. For the last 25 years, Luffy's Gum Gum abilities have been some of the most iconic in all of manga, all the way from his Gum Gum pistol, first seen in East Blue, to his most recent reveal of Gear 5 in Wano. Luffy's devil fruit has accompanied him throughout every step of his journey. Now this begs the question of just what would the series have turned out to be like if Luffy's most long-standing companion simply didn't exist? What would the series look like if Luffy no longer had his rubber abilities and he was just a regular human being? With all of the benefits and disadvantages that come with this, how would this have affected the world of One Piece? What would have changed and what would have stayed the same? This is exactly what I intend to find out in this video, where I will be deep diving into the scenario of what if Luffy had no devil fruit. In order to keep things consistent throughout this video and to ensure that we answer these questions as best as we can, I'll need to set up some guidelines that need to be followed. The first and most important one being that Luffy absolutely cannot eat a devil fruit. It may seem like an obvious point, but there are actually a few occasions in the series where the Straw Hats come across an uneaten devil fruit, but in this scenario, Luffy simply isn't interested. He decided that the risks outweigh the benefits and that he doesn't need a devil fruit ability in order to achieve his dream, especially since everyone that he has known growing up and was inspired by also never had eaten a devil fruit while he was with them. Now the most important thing to establish is something which is present in almost every single What If video ever made, which is of course plot armor. Obviously plot armor is a concept well known throughout literature as the means through which a character will survive against impossible odds or suddenly finds the solution to an unsolvable problem through a massive amount of convenience and coincidence. The reason why this is important for any what if scenario is because without it, the series would change to such a degree that it would quickly become unrecognizable. With a story as large in scale as One Piece, any interference in the timeline would have knock-on effects that quickly spiral out of control, causing the massive web of intrigue and mystery that makes up the series to become tangled and messy. The further back you go, the worse this effect will end up being. Now, as a quick example, imagine if in Chapter 2, Luffy never encounters the whirlpool that destroys his boat after he set sail from Dawn Island. This would mean that Luffy never had to escape into the barrel that was eventually founded by the members of Alvida's crew, so he never ends up meeting Kobe and he never manages to free him from his life as a pirate. If you jump all the way to Marineford, this would mean that Kobe was never there to intercept Akainu and stall long enough for Shanks to arrive and save Luffy's life. But the truth is that situation would never have happened in the first place because it was through Kobe that Luffy had first heard of a local bounty hunter named Roronoa Zoro, who he had decided would be the first member of his crew. This means that Luffy never meets and saves Zoro from Axe Hand Morgan, which suddenly takes away one of the future pillars of the Straw Hat crew. Without Zoro, Luffy would have almost certainly have been defeated by one of the several enemies that he faces in the East Blue. Just from this minor change, you can see the massive repercussions that would come about in the story, and the only way to avoid this from spiraling out of control is through a generous use of plot armor in certain places. But with all of that out of the way, let's take a look at how the story of One Piece would have changed if Luffy never had a devil fruit ability. Our story starts quite early on in Luffy's life, as the rubber abilities that he has become famous for was something that he had acquired when he was only 7 years old. Preventing Luffy from getting his hands on the Gomu Gomu No Mi is actually extremely easy and can be done in two ways. The first way would be if Shanks is just slightly more responsible and doesn't leave an unbelievably valuable devil fruit without grabbing distance of an overly curious and reckless child. While Shanks's lackadaisical demeanor didn't make this an out of character thing for him to do, it did seem weird how he had managed to let Luffy eat the fruit in the first place, unless you believe that he actually let Luffy eat the fruit on purpose, knowing the prestige that the fruit had. The second way is even simpler. We just make it so that Shanks hasn't actually stolen the Gomu Gomu No Mi when he was on Dawn Island. Instead, it is only after he sets sail to leave the East Blue that he encounters the Cypher Pole vessel in possession of the fruit, and he attacks them in order to make it his own. What he does with it from there is a mystery, but the fruit no longer holds any fate with Luffy. Luffy's lack of devil fruit would overall have little impact on his childhood. Even the circumstances with Higuma throwing Luffy into the sea, resulting in Shanks having to swim out to rescue him, which results in him losing his arm, would still play out exactly the same as it does within the manga, because Oda had established established that even before eating a devil fruit, Luffy was a terrible swimmer. Now this would continue on even following his meeting with Ace and Sabo and all their encounters with the Blue Jam pirates. The truth is that throughout his childhood, Luffy had used his devil fruit for very little other than training and familiarizing himself with it. In fact, in the absence of a devil fruit, Luffy's training would likely be even easier, as he would no longer have to learn to adapt to a completely new ability. I highly doubt that this would result in Luffy adopting another weapon in place of his rubber fists, because Luffy lacks the temperament and discipline that is required to wield something like a sword. But he also wouldn't give up the steel pipes which he, Ace, and Sabo used throughout their childhoods. Not to mention the fact that he was being infrequently trained by Garp, who is possibly the strongest non-weapon or fist user in the world. Jumping forward to the age of 17, and Luffy is now prepared to set sail from Dawn Island, just as both Ace and Sabo did before him. And the question we must ask ourselves is how strong Luffy is now without the benefit of the Gomu Gomu No Mi. The easiest comparison we have to judge this happens to be the two people who had actually grown up and trained alongside him, who are of course Ace and Sabo. Sabo is a little less useful as he was trained under the Revolutionary Army for years by the time that he was 17. They in fact had given him expert guidance and even a decent grasp of the concept of Haki. In fact, by this age, Sabo was already single-handedly taking down the castles of kingdoms which the world government was liberating, which is hardly a decent metric to compare Luffy to, who by this point had just been fighting comically large animals in a forest for most of his life. By far the best comparison is Ace, who experienced the same training as Luffy throughout his life, and had also set sail without a devil fruit. At 17, Ace was ridiculously strong, and while he benefited massively from finding a Logia devil fruit shortly after setting sail, he still managed to be a super rookie and was considered for the position of warlord only after a few months at sea. In terms of combat, Luffy would still remain ridiculously strong, and his ingenuity would remain even if he was more limited without the range of abilities that his devil fruit had granted him. And this is without mentioning possibly the most important thing to consider when discussing Luffy, which is his absolutely monstrous strength. Even among One Piece characters, Luffy's physical abilities stand out as extraordinary. From his feats as a child defeating the gigantic wild beasts on Dawn Island, to defeating Bellamy in a single punch without even utilizing his devil fruit, Luffy has always stood out amongst the conventional humans in One Piece as a freak of nature in regard to his strength. Without the addition of the abilities from the Gomu Gomu No Mi, it will be Luffy's ridiculous strength and battle instincts that will help to carry him through the dangers of the seas. When it comes to the East Blue portion of the story, Luffy is unlikely to face any difficulty in being as successful as he was within the original story. Alvida would fall just as simply from one punch thanks to Luffy's strength. Axe-Hand Morgan would prove incapable of facing the combined might of Luffy and Zoro. Buggy's complacency would once again be his undoing, as his own devil fruit ability would end up being used against him. In terms of Captain Kuro, who was defeated thanks to Luffy's devil fruit originally, would still lose since Luffy had managed to identify the weakness of his technique. Don Creek's armor would be shattered once more, and Arlong, while still an extremely tough opponent, would be no match for an enraged Luffy fighting for one of his Nakama. In fact, the fight against Arlong would likely be even easier than normal, as without the drawbacks from having a devil fruit, the entire sequence where Luffy is trapped underwater would no longer be an issue. Logtown would be one situation where things would transpire slightly worse for Luffy than they did within the actual manga. In Logtown, Buggy and Alvida conspired to kill Luffy by having him executed on the same platform on which Goldie Roger was killed 22 years previously. It was only through an act of God, or more likely Monkey D. Dragon, which had ended up saving Luffy because lightning had struck and destroyed the platform before the blade could fall. In the actual story, Luffy laughs the situation off completely unharmed while Buggy is burnt to a crisp. Now, Luffy being impervious to lightning and electricity is something that was also highlighted in his fight against NL, but without his devil fruit ability effectively turning him into rubber, Luffy has no such protection. While Luffy has always been more resilient than the average person, even beyond the effect of his Zoan devil fruit, he would still be seriously injured by such a powerful strike, which means that in this what if scenario, it leaves him to rely on Zoro in order to escape. This means that he would still stand no chance when the pair encounter Smoker chasing after them, and at this point in the series, and realistically for the entire pre-time skip, Smoker is an opponent that the Straw Hats simply wouldn't be able to actually beat. Logia Devil Fruit users are almost invincible without Haki, unless you can find an elemental weakness of theirs like water to Crocodile or rubber to Enel. And while Smoker's Sea Stone Baton wouldn't do anything to Luffy, he would still be strong enough to capture him, which summons Monkey D. Dragon himself to save his son once more. Now this may just seem like a mildly interesting coincidence, but it has the potential to change the entire future of the One Piece world as we know it. This of course would allow Luffy to sail away from Log Town with the rest of the Straw Hats as they travel towards Reverse Mountain. As we go into the Grand Line, Luffy's lack of Devil Fruit is unlikely to play a major role for the first few arcs. The fact is, no opponent which Luffy and the Straw Hats had faced throughout Reverse Mountain, Whiskey Peak, Little Garden, and Drum Island were enough to push any of them to their limits. Nor was any situation that Luffy had found himself in something that he would have been incapable of handling without his Devil Fruit. The fact is, Luffy's strength, determination, and creativity are going to be enough to get him through most of his encounters in the story. The few exceptions are mostly going to be the extremely powerful foes that he faces. Speaking of which, the Alabasta arc introduces us to one of the Warlords of the Sea, Sir Crocodile. The fact that Crocodile in the modern day stands as 50% of the fighting force of a Yonko crew should be enough to prove to you just how strong he really is. And this was something that was experienced in this arc, as he had beaten Luffy nearly to death on no less than 3 separate occasions. As with Smoker, Crocodile's Logia abilities are not something that Luffy is able to overcome until he finds his weakness, since Haki is still beyond him at this point in time. And while Luffy won't exactly be able to inflate himself to comically large sizes in order to store water this time around, but Luffy's ingenuity will allow him to find ways to overcome the Desert Sovereign and to liberate the Alabasta Kingdom. Moving on to the Jaya arc, and it is here that we have the introduction of both Blackbeard and Bellamy, one of whom is far more fearsome than the other. Luffy didn't have to use his Devil Fruit to beat Bellamy originally, and once again he would get revenge for Mont Blanc Cricket with one single powerful punch. Skypeia poses one of the biggest problems for Luffy, as it's possibly the only arc where Luffy had to rely entirely on his Devil Fruit in order to defeat his main opponent. Without being a natural counter to Enel's ability, it is very difficult to imagine a scenario where Luffy could win this fight. Remember, Enel managed to defeat both Sanji and Zoro in one attack, and was able to use Observation Haki before the Straw Hats had even heard of it. Despite racking my brain, and even with Luffy's immense strength and exceptional battle instincts taken into account, I simply couldn't come up with a way for him to win this fight without his Devil Fruit. If you can think of any possible way in which Luffy would be able to beat Enel without his immunity to lightning, then let me know in the comments, as I'd be interested to hear what kind of situations would be able to solve this unsolvable problem. Now going on to Water 7, there would be practically no change in the first half of this saga. Water 7 simply acts as the setup for the main event of retrieving Robin from the world government stronghold of Enies Lobby. Enies Lobby is the first time that we see Luffy really start to investigate the limits of his Devil Fruit ability, where he creates both Gear 2nd and Gear 3rd. These abilities were vital for his success in beating Rob Lucci and ultimately saving Robin, so how would he fare without them? Well, in this situation, Luffy would instead showcase his battle instincts, learning and mastering every Rokujo Shiki technique on the fly as they are being shown to him. This is already something he achieved with Gear 2nd, which was an advancement on the Rokujo Shiki technique Soru. It would also make sense for Luffy to adapt another of the Rokujo Shiki abilities, Shigan, in order to act in place of Gear 3rd, where Gear 3rd had Luffy inflating a part of his body to a massive size, greatly increasing his power. His new ability would be to just adjust Shigan in order to use his whole fist instead of just a finger. The result would be a massive increase in the power of his punches, but far more concentrated than the large attack range of his Gear 3rd moves. His fight with Lucci, who himself is a master of all 6 forms of Rokushiki, as well as the Rokugan, would push Luffy further than any fight that he has experienced thus far. But in the end, it would only serve as an opportunity for Luffy to fully master these abilities against an opponent who is strong enough to push him to his very limit. The following 3 arcs, Thriller Bark, Shabundi Archipelago, and Amazon Lily, are all rather anticlimactic for this what-if scenario. While each arc had posed its own problems for Luffy and the Straw Hats to overcome, in none of them was Luffy's Devil Fruit the ultimate reason for his success. Nightmare Luffy would still appear in the fight against against Gecko Moria, Luffy would still knock Saint Charlos away in one of the most memorable punches in anime, and Kumo would still separate these Straw Hats across the world. And just like in the main canon, Luffy would still end up melting the heart of the man-hating Boa Hancock, who would then help him with his infiltration of Impel Down before he, alongside an army of prisoners, depart for Marineford. The battleground that was Marineford is something way out of the ability of Luffy at this point in time to handle. With or without a Devil Fruit, Luffy didn't even rank in the top 50 in terms of strongest fighters who were taking part in this war. There would definitely be some points where Luffy's lack of Devil Fruit would have made things even harder for him, not least of which is when he receives an attack from Fleet Admiral Sengoku, which he originally inflates himself to protect both himself and Ace from. It was nothing short of a miracle that Luffy managed to survive the war even with his Devil Fruit, and it would be even more of a miracle if he were to survive it without a Devil Fruit, especially when you have the Surgeon of Death fighting against fate itself in order to keep you alive. One important thing that we need to question before getting onto the time skip relates to Luffy's bounty. Bounties have always been one of the most exciting things in One Piece, and the rise of Luffy's bounty has always been exceptional, even among other super rookies. But it is an important thing to remember that the world government can also have motivations behind the bounties that they assign to someone beyond simply the strength of the individual. They also take into account the threat that the person poses to the world government. We have seen this in at least two examples, via Nico Robin and Podcast Ace. Robin's bounty was artificially inflated when she was only a child simply because of the threat which her ability to read the poneglyph had posed to the Celestial Dragons. I went into this in far more detail in my video covering Robin's backstory in its entirety, but the basic idea was that the world government falsely pinned the crime of destroying the marine vessels off of the coast of Ohara on Robin, which in reality Jaguar D Sol was responsible for. They had then claimed that she was intending on using her knowledge to acquire the ancient weapons and to cause untold destruction with them. As a result, Robin became known as a devil child with a bounty of 79 million, and this was as an 8-year-old. While facing vastly different circumstances, Podcast D Ace also faced similar discrimination at the hands of the world government. This is pointed out directly in the Ace novels when he first encounters Shanks in the New World. Ben Beckman makes an assessment of Ace's potential and personality, and one of the things that he questions is if there is a reason behind Ace's really high bounty, which in his opinion is way too high based upon Ace's strength and actions at that point in the story. Additionally, Shanks starts putting together the pieces behind Ace's heritage as the son of the Pirate King, indirectly showing us that the world government has also figured this out and has increased Ace's bounty accordingly. Now the question that we need to ask ourselves is, did the world government increase Luffy's bounty higher than they otherwise would have simply because he had consumed the Gomu Gomu No Mi, which the Gorosei were well aware was secretly the Hito Hito no Mi model Nika? This means that if Luffy had no Devil Fruit, then it would impact his bounty. Now don't get me wrong, his bounty would still be high because of his actions against the world government as well as his relation to Monkey D. Dragon, but it would be quite a bit lower than what it is within the canon story of the manga. Back in the Jaya arc, we get the introduction of one of the strongest and most important characters in the entire series, Blackbeard. At this point in time, Blackbeard was only just forming his crew, having fled from the Whitebeard pirates after killing Thatch for the Yami Yami no Mi. His plan was to find a high-ticket pirate in order to hand them into the world government so that he could claim a position as a warlord, which he eventually uses to access Impel Down and to then recruit some of the level 6 prisoners there. Now the pirate that he turns in ends up being Ace, who he defeats in their epic battle on Bonaro Island. However, the pirate that he originally wanted to turn in was Luffy. While it was unlikely Ace would have ever retreated from the fight, even when it became apparent that Blackbeard was stronger than he had thought, it was the knowledge that Luffy would be next in Blackbeard's sight. This had removed the possibility of Ace retreating entirely, as he stood firm in order to protect his younger brother. Imagine a world where Blackbeard wasn't interested in Luffy since his bounty was too low to earn his attention. Would Ace have fled when it had seemed like things weren't going his way? While it does seem like a long shot, just imagine the repercussions that it would have on the world. There would have been no Marineford War, no death of Whitebeard and Ace, as well as no breakout from Impel Down, and ultimately no rise of Blackbeard. Each and every one of these changes would have massive knock-on effects, not least for the Straw Hats. But since this video is focusing more on the impact of Luffy having no Devil Fruit, we won't be going down this path here. If you would like to see a separate video on this topic, then let me know in the comments. If there's enough support, it'll motivate me into making a video on how the world would have changed if Ace had won his fight against Blackbeard. So coming back from that tangent, we can now jump back onto the main story where we find ourselves at the point of the time skip. During the time skip and before anyone asks, yes, a time skip of some kind needs to take place, otherwise the Straw Hat crew would immediately be destroyed in the new world. Luffy would be taught the concepts of Haki by Rayleigh. The difference this time though is that he would likely learn far more. Without a devil fruit that Luffy needs to learn to incorporate with his Haki, he would be able to dedicate his entire time to learning the foundations of Haki itself. Instead of creating his multiple Gear 4 abilities, Rayleigh would be able to teach Luffy more finely tuned and advanced Haki techniques. I would assume that by the time that his training is complete, Luffy would at least be capable of utilizing advanced observation Haki or future sight and advanced armament Haki or Ryo. Even if his success rate with these abilities isn't 100%, the impact that it would have on Luffy's overall strength is possibly even greater than what his Gear 4 abilities had given him. With this in mind, Luffy emerging into the new world would likely be even smoother than it was originally. Absolutely no one would be his opponent in Fishman Island, which realistically is exactly how it was anyway. Caesar Clown wouldn't be able to stand against Luffy given that poison is mostly ineffective against him at this point, and Doflamingo would take far more damage from a Luffy who is capable of using advanced armament Haki. Doflamingo would still be an extremely tough battle, especially since it took multiple rounds of Gear 4 to beat him originally, but Luffy's advanced armament and observation Haki aren't as intensive to use as Gear 4 is, meaning that he can use them throughout more of the fight and deal more damage early on. Luffy still wouldn't be able to face off against admirals at this point, but luckily for him, Admiral Fujitora is more interested in what's right than simply defeating pirates for the sake of it. Whole Cake Island also wouldn't change too much, as Luffy's main use of his devil fruit only came at the very end, during his fight against Katakuri. This fight would be easy for Luffy, because this time Luffy would enter the fight with knowledge of future sight and how to use it, which means that he would identify Katakuri's weakness a lot quicker. Actually capitalizing on that is a different matter though, as he no longer has Gear 4 Snake Man as an option. Ultimately though, Luffy's own ability to utilize future sight would likely level the playing field enough that he would be able to use his stronger Haki to overcome Katakuri's devil fruit. The impact that his advanced armament Haki would play would also be significant, as the fight originally became a test of endurance, something that I think Luffy would win a lot sooner if he was able to use advanced armament Haki. This now leads us to the final completed arc of One Piece, which is the Wano arc. Researching how Luffy would deal with having no devil fruit during the climax of the Wano arc, and how he would fare without his strongest ability Gear 5, has been very challenging. Within the canon manga, Gear 5 was the plot armor which had allowed Luffy to defeat the strongest creature in the world. It was an ability which quite literally brought him back from the dead, and without it, how could Luffy ever hope to beat Kaido? The answer within this what if scenario is Haki. Kaido himself said it quite clearly during their fight. The only way to rule the world is through Haki. The question now becomes, is Luffy's Haki strong enough to contend with the King of Beasts? It would be worthwhile at this point to think of just what that kind of strength actually looks like. Without a devil fruit and solely relying on Haki, Luffy would need to be at least as strong as what we had seen from Garp during his attack on Blackbeard's island, as well as his fight with Aokiji. What Garp had showed there was the ability of someone who can fight against the strongest people in the world with nothing but his bare hands and his Haki. Luffy would need to be able to do the exact same thing, but if not more, in order to defeat Kaido. And I think that he would be pretty well placed to do so, because at this point he would have already mastered his advanced observation and armament Haki abilities. While these on their own wouldn't be enough to beat Kaido, it would free up Luffy to learn an even more powerful technique from Hyogoro. The only remaining thing for Luffy to learn would be advanced Conqueror's Haki, or the ability to amplify his attacks using his Conqueror's Haki. For the very top level fights in One Piece, this ability appears to be a must-have to even consider being able to beat your opponent. So by focusing his training arc on this instead of the equally vital but less impactful Ryo, Luffy would increase his strength by a significant amount. While we can only wonder if that increase in strength would be able to match up the power of Gear 5, there is still one more important thing to consider when asking if Luffy can beat Kaido in this situation. If Luffy had no devil fruit, then would Luffy still be Joy Boy? Zunisha's declaration that Joy Boy has returned after Luffy awakened Gear 5 was as clear an indication as any that Joy Boy was the wielder of the Nika fruit, and Kaido himself said that the man who would defeat him would only be Joy Boy, and we all know who defeated defeated Kaido. So is Luffy still Joy Boy without his devil fruit? I think the answer is yes. The Gorosei stated that Zoan devil fruits can have a will of their own, and that the Hito Hito no Mi model Nika has eluded them for years by design. So what if it isn't the case that the devil fruit makes someone Joy Boy, but that the devil fruit actually finds Joy Boy? If you extend this to the actual series, it explains why such a legendary devil fruit had managed to find its way to the mouth of a 7-year-old who at the time was hidden in a small village in a random corner of the East Blue. His ability to utilize Haki as a result of being trained by Rayleigh and it being perfected through countless life or death battles through the New World and within Wano would be enough to finally topple one of the Yonko. How Luffy's lack of devil fruit would impact him after Wano is something that's difficult to speculate on. We haven't gotten far enough into the Egghead Island arc for much to have actually changed, and any arcs or events that occur beyond the Egghead Island arc would only be pure speculation. In this what if scenario, Luffy may have an advantage should he ever fight Blackbeard in the future, as one of the Yami Yami no Mi's key abilities is the nullification of other devil fruits, something which would be completely useless against a man without a devil fruit. But with or without a devil fruit, Joy Boy or not, I don't think that there's anyone in the world that would be able to stop Luffy from becoming the king of the pirates after everything is said and done. So this is one of my first what if scenarios that I've explored on my channel. If you've enjoyed this kind of video, then remember to leave a like and a comment under this video and let me know your thoughts on what would have happened if Luffy had no devil fruit in the story. If you have any ideas for similar what if videos, then leave your suggestions in the comments. And lastly, be sure to subscribe to the channel so that you're up to date on all of my One Piece videos as I upload regular chapter reviews, theories, character analysis and much more. Thanks for making it to the end of this video and I cannot wait to see you in my next One Piece video.
If you enjoy my content, then you can support my channel through Patreon for as little as $1 a month, or even through YouTube by becoming a channel member. You will gain access to exclusive channel perks and a Discord server which I frequently use. So become a member of my Zero Division and be the first to know about my upcoming videos. And once again, thank you for sticking around till the end of the video, and whatever you contribute will mean a lot to me.